My name is James Tenney. I'm a composer, and I teach composition and some other things here at CalArts. The most recent piece that I've finished is a piece for larger orchestra. It was a commission from the Bavarian Radio Symphony in Munich. And it will be performed there not this season, but next season. But I've done everything from electronic and computer music to music for solo instruments, string quartets, chamber ensembles of various kinds, and orchestra.
How do you teach composition?
It's impossible. What you do is try to figure out what the student intends, what the student wants to do, and then see if you can help the student achieve that. I don't see it as my job to impose my own aesthetic on the student, but rather to facilitate their realizing their musical ideas. And this involves a number of factors like notation, instrumentation, even things like rhythmic organization, which means that sometimes I'm teaching conducting as well as composition, or teaching conducting as part of teaching composition. We're dealing with harmony, but not usually in a traditional sense. It's 20th century harmony, which is much more complex than most people are used to. But nevertheless, there is an important harmonic component in any new music. We're dealing with acoustics, musical acoustics. I believe composers need to understand the physics of sound and of musical instruments and of how we hear. So it's a complex subject with many levels and many different branches, but they're all fascinating to me. Another aspect is history, the literature of music that I feel any young composer needs to be familiar with, to be literate about the music that's been done in this last century, for example.
Do you have a definition for composition that you like?
No, I've never thought about it that way. It is in some fashion organizing sound or organizing a situation where sounds will be produced. There's such a variety now of ways of making music that this has affected composition in the sense that there's a variety of compositional procedures and compositional approaches and attitudes that may be taken at different times.
Well, what skills or tools do you want your students to bring to the effort of composition?
Well, they almost invariably they need to have had considerable experience playing music on some instrument or instruments. They need to have gone through ear training courses so that they can identify what they're hearing. They know what they're hearing when they listen to a piece of music, by which I mean they can identify intervals and chords and rhythms and meters and so forth. They can identify musical instruments just by ear. And I believe they should have a familiarity with the important music literature, that is the music, the scores and recordings of important pieces in the 20th century and earlier. But the 20th century music tends to be less emphasized in their earlier training. So most students get here, they know quite a bit about Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, but not a whole lot about Schoenberg and Ives and Varese and Cage. I think it would be good experience for every musician of any sort to have some compositional experience. However, we don't really have the time or the resources to do that. A number of students who are not majoring in composition do take composition courses of one kind or another, but it's not a thorough sort of thing. There's no way we can make it a required course or anything like that. I have something like 8 or 10 private students here, okay? That is, I'm dealing with them for an hour a week in a composition lesson. In addition to that, I teach 2 courses, 2 classes, classroom courses. So I work hard. And but any time a performer or a music theory, a person specializing in music theory or ethnomusicology or something like that, whenever they express an interest in doing some composing, we bend over backward to try to make it possible for them. That's hard to put in words because a good deal of one's response to this work is kind of intuitive, and, you know, you look for a certain literacy in 2 senses. One is that they know something about how to put their ideas down on paper, right? And the other is that they may display some awareness of what's gone on before. None of us is born in a vacuum, culturally. We have predecessors and need to know what has gone down before. Not just so that we don't reinvent the wheel, but because it is very inspiring to become familiar with all that great music.
Do you teach your students to follow the rules or break the rules?
There aren't really any rules anymore. There are conditions, there are relationships that can be pointed out. There are situations where if you choose A, that means you are not going to be able to have B, right? That you can't have everything at once. But there are the notion of a rule-based creative process is an old-fashioned one that we don't adhere to here. Well, I started off as a piano student, taking lessons from the age of 8 on. And when I was in my teenage years, getting finally really, really interested in playing, and for a while I thought I might want to become a concert pianist. But I began composing long before I'd had any kind of training in that discipline. And at first, my compositions were very naive and so forth, but I kept working at it, and gradually the desire to compose kind of overtook my desire to be a performing pianist. And so in school, I gradually went from, or actually rather suddenly, changed from a major in performance to a major in composition.
Do you have heroes?
Oh, yes. Lots of them.
Name a few of them and why?
Well, I would say Charles Ives, Edgar Varese, whom I studied with. Yes. Carl Ruggles, I also knew very well. John Cage was a friend and a collaborator. So these are my cultural heroes in the musical sense. Plus, some of the European composers that I never met, like Schoenberg and Webern and Stravinsky and Bartók. These are all very, very great composers. And I'm sure their music has influenced me in a variety of ways, many of which I'm not even conscious of. But a good deal of what I learned from Varese had to do with instrumentation and orchestration, because he was very conscious of this. It was important to him. He was very knowledgeable about musical acoustics and was aware of what was going on when he put certain instruments together, had them sounding together. And you'll find in his works really unusual combinations and unusual placements of the instruments with respect to their registers and things like that, that although they're unusual, when you think about why he might have done it that way, you come to the realization it was because of his very profound knowledge of musical acoustics. Okay? Yeah. He was also a wonderful sort of French gentleman, and married to this very beautiful, wonderful woman named Louise, who was a translator of Rimbaud and other French poets. So it was, Varèse's home was a very wonderful place to visit.
What did you learn from John Cage?
Oh, so many things, starting with some of the things that he wrote and his ideas that are first expressed in the book Silence of 1961, although that's actually a collection of talks and essays, articles that he had written going way back to the 30s. Again, ideas about the nature of sound, the nature of the hearing process, and a kind of, in fact, a radically new aesthetic about the creative process itself. He's the first one seriously to suggest that we might find another way of making music that involves relinquishing some of the control that it was always assumed the creative person had to have, right? What else? I like to tell the story that he was often asked what his definition of music was, and he gave different answers to that question, depending on the situation or how he felt that day or whatever. Once when somebody asked him that, he said, music is work. Right? Another time, he said, sounds heard, which I find a really remarkable definition of music, because there's no composer in it. Which means the shift of emphasis is from the composer back over to the listener. That it's the listening experience, the listening attitude that is the most important aspect of the whole enterprise. So I like to suggest to my students that even if they finally disagree with that they really think about that definition. Follow your dream, all right? Try to arrange your life so that you can do what you want to do what you love to do. Don't let earning a living be your first priority, because that can very quickly interfere with doing what you want to do. And people that imagine that they're going to settle that question first and then find a way around it, I think, are usually frustrated. Now, one exception to that was Charles Ives, whom I've mentioned now 2 or 3 times, who, for sort of social philosophical reasons, decided that he was not going to, as he put it, let his children starve on his dissonances. So he got into business, the insurance business, when it was at the very beginning, and actually ended up heading his own company and making a very comfortable living at it. And then composing in the evenings and on weekends and on holidays, right? But it finally wore him out. And, he burned out at a certain point. And the last 30 years of his life wrote hardly any music. And that's a sad thing. So I say to young people who have a desire to do something creative, make that your first priority. Then find a way to support it.